I flew across the country for my sister's wedding, only to be turned away at the door like a stranger. But the small silver box I left behind on the gift table did not just hold a wedding present. It held the truth that was about to destroy everything she had carefully built in front of hundreds of people. My name is Myra Wells. I am 28 years old. And I do not think there has ever been a day in my life that made me feel more like a stranger to my own family than the day I flew from Los Angeles to Boston for my sister Victoria's wedding. I had prepared so simply for it. A modest dress, low heels, and a small silver gift box tied with a white ribbon that I had carefully done myself. I was not expecting to be the center of attention or welcomed with warmth. In my mind, I only thought that no matter how distant things had always been between me and my family, this was still my sister's wedding day. I wanted to believe, maybe foolishly, that there would still be a place for me in a moment like that. The Grand Belmont looked exactly like the kind of place Victoria had always dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers lit up the lobby. Soft string music floated through the air. And guests in expensive gowns and tailored suits moved around as if they belonged to another world. I stepped up to the reception table and gave my name as calmly as I could. The staff smiled politely, then bent over the guest list. They checked once, then twice, then a third time. Their expressions changed. One of them looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and pity, and quietly told me that my name was not on the list. I still remember the feeling in that moment. It was not pure shock, because some part of me had always prepared for rejection. But hearing it out loud, standing in that beautiful lobby surrounded by strangers, felt like being told once again that I did not belong. Not even here. Not even now. I tightened my hold on the silver box and understood that this trip was not going to end the way I had once hoped. I stepped away from the reception desk and stood off to the side of the lobby, trying to steady my breathing. My hand was firm around my phone, but inside my chest, my heart was pounding so hard that it felt visible. I told myself it could still be a mistake. Maybe the staff had looked too quickly. Maybe my invitation had been lost. Maybe somewhere, somehow, there was still a simple explanation. I clung to those tiny possibilities for a few more seconds before I finally called Victoria. She answered after a couple of rings, her voice sharp and irritated, as if I were interrupting something important. I told her I had arrived, but my name was not on the guest list. There was a pause on the other end. That pause was long enough for me to understand this was not an accident. Then Victoria let out a cold little laugh and told me she already knew. Because I had never been invited in the first place. I stood there in the middle of that elegant wedding lobby and listened as my own sister said this wedding was for people who mattered. For people who were important. Not for someone who takes pictures for a living. She asked me if I had really thought I would be invited. Every word hit with the same force as a slap. I did not argue. I did not cry. There had been a time in my life when I would have begged to be included. When I would have believed that if I were quieter, as a part into a better, more successful, maybe I would finally be enough. But in that moment, something became painfully simple. In Victoria's world, I had never really been her sister. I had only ever been someone easy to erase. When I told her I had only wanted to leave a wedding gift and wish her well, she mocked that too. She asked what I could possibly give her that she did not already have. I let her finish. Then I quietly told her I understood. And I did. I understood that I would not walk into that ballroom as family. But I also understood that some truths do not need a seat at the wedding table in order to arrive. After the call ended, I did not linger. I slipped my phone back into my bag, straightened the white ribbon on the silver box, and walked toward the gift table. The entire room was so extravagant that my gift looked almost laughably small by comparison. Around me were oversized boxes wrapped in imported paper, thick envelopes, designer bags, and every polished symbol of wealth that would have made Victoria smile. My silver box was quiet, light, and easy to overlook. But I knew the weight of what was inside it. And that mattered more than appearance ever could. I found an empty place near the edge of the table and carefully set the box down. Then I pulled out the card I had brought and tucked it neatly beneath the ribbon. It read, "To Victoria. From your sister, Myra." I wanted those words to be impossible to ignore. Not because I was asking to be claimed as family, but because I wanted no one to be able to pretend this gift had come from a stranger. It came from the sister she had just denied. One of the reception girls approached me gently and asked if I was sure I did not want to stay. She said she could try speaking to the wedding coordinator if I wanted. Her kindness almost broke something in me, because it was more compassion than I had received from my own family that day. But I smiled and shook my head. I told her that sometimes a gift speaks louder when the person who left it is no longer there. She blinked at me, clearly unsure what I meant. But she did not press further. I turned and walked away through the lobby, past the chandeliers and the music and the beautifully dressed guests moving toward the ballroom. I did not look back. I did not feel like I was running away. I felt like I had put something exactly where it needed to be. I had come. I had shown up. I had left what I needed to leave. The rest no longer belonged to me. When the hotel doors closed behind me, the cold Boston air hit my face. Crisp and clean, I drew in a long breath, called a taxi to the airport, and knew that once Victoria opened that silver box, not just she, but my entire family, would finally have to face the truth they had spent years ignoring. To understand why I flew back to Boston at all, you have to go much further back, to the 3-story colonial house in Beacon Hill where I grew up. From the outside, my family looked exactly like the kind of family people admire. We had money, status, the right addresses, the right vacations, the right charities, the right polished image. But inside those walls, there were 2 daughters, and only one of them truly mattered. Victoria was 3 years older than me. Beautiful, magnetic, and instinctively aware of how to draw a room toward herself. She had the larger bedroom, the nicer clothes, piano lessons, dance recitals, and parents who actually showed up to watch her. I got the hand-me-downs, the leftovers, and the silence. She was the daughter who reflected well on the family image. I was the one who was expected not to take up too much space. The cruelty of it was not always dramatic. There were no daily shouting matches or obvious scenes. It lived in the small details repeated often enough to become law. When Victoria spoke, people listened. When I spoke, they nodded distractedly and moved on. When she wanted something, it became a family priority. When I wanted something, it was treated like a phase. I grew up in the same house, eating at the same table, sharing the same last name. Yet I often felt like a shadow wandering through someone else's story. I think that was the most painful part. Not being openly hated, but being quietly treated as if my presence was optional. I cannot count how many dinners I sat through while my parents discussed Victoria's future, as though mine did not exist. Over time, I learned to shrink myself, to ask for less, to stay quiet, to accept being overlooked before anyone had the chance to do it again. But children still hope. No matter how many times they are forgotten, some part of them keeps waiting for a moment when someone will finally turn and say, "I see you." For me, that hope lasted longer than it should have. And maybe that is why every disappointment cut so deeply. I was not just losing a place in the family. I was losing, over and over, the dream that I had ever really had one. The day I turned 10 was the day I truly understood what my place in the family was. I had been excited for weeks. Turning 10 felt important, like crossing into something bigger. I imagined balloons, A cake with my name on it. Maybe a few friends from school. Or at least a dinner where my parents looked at me as if the day actually belonged to me. That morning I woke up early, ran downstairs, and carried all that childish excitement with me into the kitchen. The kitchen was empty in the way it often was when something only mattered to me. My mother was on the phone planning Victoria's upcoming social event. My father had already gone to work. When I reminded my mother that it was my birthday, she covered the receiver and told me they would do something later. They never did. The day passed like any other. No cake. No presents. No special dinner. No real acknowledgement. I sat in my room that evening, trying to tell myself maybe everyone had just gotten busy. Maybe they would remember at the last minute. But they did not. Then there was a knock on my bedroom door. My grandmother Eleanor walked in holding a small wrapped box. She sat beside me on the bed and wished me a happy birthday with more warmth than I had heard all day. Inside the box was a real camera. Not a toy one. It felt heavy and important in my small hands. Silver and beautiful under my bedroom light. Then she touched my cheek and told me I had an artist's eye. She said one day, the world would see what she saw in me. Those words stayed with me far longer than any gift could have. That camera was the first thing anyone in my family ever gave me that felt like recognition. Not obligation. And if you have ever felt invisible to the people who should have loved you most, then comment because I know exactly how that silence feels. That night I fell asleep holding that camera against my chest, not knowing my grandmother had just placed my future into my hands. 8 years later, I graduated from high school with a full scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the best art schools in the country. To me, that was not just an achievement, it was proof that my love for photography was real, that it had shape and direction and possibility, no matter how often my father dismissed it. I had been chosen to give a speech at graduation, and for weeks, I practiced every line. Somewhere deep inside me, there was still a small, hopeful part that believed this time my parents would come, sit in the audience, and finally feel proud of me. The morning of graduation, I came downstairs in my cap and gown with my speech notes in hand. Victoria was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. My parents were hunched over my father's laptop, focused on something else entirely. I reminded them that the ceremony started at 2 and that we should leave by 1 if we wanted decent seats. My mother did not look up. My father barely glanced at me before saying that Victoria had a networking event with Goldman Sachs and that it was too important to miss. I remember standing there in that gown, holding my notes so tightly that the paper crumpled in my hands. I told them it was my graduation. My father answered in the calmest voice imaginable that photography was not a real career and maybe I should consider business school like my sister. Victoria just sat there with that quiet smirk. She never needed words to explain. So I went alone. I gave my speech to a room full of strangers. When they called my name and I walked across the stage, I looked out at the audience and saw only one familiar face. Grandma Eleanor. Front row, clapping louder than anyone. Afterward, she took my hands and told me that the greatest treasures are not always the things people fight over. Sometimes, they are the things quietly passed down. I did not understand what she meant then. But that was the day I stopped waiting for my family to recognize me. It was the day I realized that if I wanted a life where I mattered, I would have to build it somewhere beyond their reach. After graduation, I packed 2 suitcases, bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, and left Boston with barely a goodbye. The truth is, there was almost no one to say goodbye to. No one asked when I was leaving, where I would stay, or how I planned to support myself. My departure created no visible emptiness in that house. And maybe that was what gave me the courage to go. I took my grandmother's camera, a little savings, and a silent promise to myself if I could not be seen in the place where I was born, then I would build a life somewhere else where no one had the power to decide whether I mattered. Los Angeles was not easy in the beginning. I started as an assistant to a wedding photographer. I carried heavy equipment, adjusted lighting, pinned down veils in the wind, and learned how to move quietly around the emotions of a wedding day. I studied everything: light, timing, composition, body language, how to calm nervous brides, how to tell a story with one frame. I said yes to long hours and low pay, because I understood I was learning the foundation of something that would one day belong to me. Slowly, things changed. One client led to another. One referral became 5. I saved every dollar I could and eventually created Everlight Studios. At first, it was barely more than a name and a rented desk. But it grew. I hired people. I built a team. My work was featured in magazines. My client list expanded. We photographed elegant weddings, celebrity events, foundation galas. We became the kind of company people booked months, even years, in advance. At our strongest point, the company brought in $3 million in a single year. My family knew none of it. Or, if they heard small pieces, they never bothered to ask more. To them, I was still Myra who takes pictures. For a long time, I told myself I was fine with that. I told myself I did not need their recognition anymore because I had built something real without them. But the truth is, some wounds do not disappear. They just go quiet until something touches them deeply enough to make them ache again. That something came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing contracts in my office. My phone rang with a Boston number I did not recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Harrison Lawson, my grandmother Eleanor's attorney. Within seconds, the world inside me went still. My grandmother had passed away the night before. Even though I knew her health had been declining for years, I was not ready to hear those words. I always believed there would be more time. One more visit. One more phone call. One more chance to tell her what that camera she gave me had made possible. I flew back to Boston the same day. Her funeral was held at Trinity Church, filled with people she had mentored, funded, supported, and loved through the arts. I sat in the third row alone. Up front, my parents received condolences. Victoria stood beside them in a black designer dress, dabbing at her eyes. But even in the middle of mourning, I could hear her whispering to my mother about my grandmother's jewelry collection, asking the attorney when the pieces would be released. I stared at my grandmother's casket and felt something cold move through me. The only person in my family who had truly seen me was gone, and the rest of them were already inventorying what she had left behind. After the service, Mr. Lawson touched my shoulder and asked me to stay. In a small office behind the church, he handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a notarized amendment to my grandmother's estate and a handwritten letter. I read the amendment 3 times before I believed it. The entire Hartwell jewelry collection, valued at $2 million, had been left to me. Not to Victoria. Not to my mother. To me. Then I opened the letter. My grandmother wrote that Victoria saw the pieces as trophies. But I would understand their history, meaning, and care. She knew people would be angry. She knew they would say she had made a mistake. But she wanted the collection to belong to the person who would honor it. I pressed that letter to my chest and cried. It was not just an inheritance. It was my grandmother's final way of telling me that she had always known exactly who I was. My grandmother's letter was not long, but every sentence felt like it opened an entire hidden history between us. She wrote that beauty is not about possession. It is about preservation. To most people, the Hartwell collection would just look like luxury pearls, diamonds, sapphires, heirloom pieces worth admiring for their price and prestige. But to her, they were stories. They were memory. They were the visible thread between generations of women who had worn them, cared for them, and passed them down with love instead of vanity. She said Victoria would see them as trophies. I did not have to argue with that because I already knew it was true. Victoria had always treated beautiful things as extensions of herself. A dress was not just a dress if it made people stare. A relationship was not just a relationship if it elevated her social standing. The Hartwell jewelry would have become another polished symbol in the performance she was constantly staging for the world. My grandmother saw that clearly. She also saw that I would never wear those pieces just to be admired. I would care about where they came from, whose hands had touched them, what they meant before they ever became valuable. What broke me the most was not the value of the collection. It was the fact that she understood me so precisely. In a family that had spent years seeing me as the lesser daughter, she had recognized something entirely different. She saw patience in me, quietness, the ability to look at an object and feel the life inside its story. In that way, the camera she gave me when I was 10 and this letter years later were really the same gift. Recognition. Mr. Lawson also told me my grandmother wanted everything kept confidential until I decided the time was right to reveal it. I left that church carrying the documents in my bag and the secret in my chest. I did not think of it as a weapon. I thought of it as her voice, entrusted to me. But I also knew that once this truth came out, it would not only disappoint Victoria, it would shatter the version of our family that everyone had been pretending was real for years. 3 months after the funeral, I heard that Victoria was engaged to Marcus Thornton. The name alone told me everything I needed to know. He came from exactly the kind of old money family my parents had always wanted for their golden daughter, wealth paired with wealth. Status. An alliance that looked perfect on paper. The wedding would take place at the Grand Belmont in Boston. With 400 guests and a 6-figure budget, I learned all this not from my family, but from Victoria's social media posts. Dress fittings, champagne toasts, venue reveals, luxury registry items. Every polished detail displayed, like a campaign built around her own perfection. I waited for an invitation. It sounds foolish now, but I really did wait. Day after day, I checked the mail and refreshed my inbox, telling myself that no matter how strained things had always been, I was still the bride's sister. Eventually, I called my mother and asked, as gently as I could, whether the invitation had been delayed or whether I should RSVP directly to Victoria. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind of pause people use before delivering a cruelty they already rehearsed. My mother told me the wedding would be very intimate, and Victoria felt it would be better if I did not attend. Intimate. I almost laughed, because I had already seen the posts about 400 guests. Then she added that I could be awkward at events like these and they did not want anything distracting from Victoria's day. I sat there in silence, phone against my ear, and felt as if the last doorway into that family had quietly been closed in my face. If you have ever watched someone show the whole world their perfect life while deliberately erasing you from the picture, then hit like on this video. Because some pain looks very quiet from the outside while burning deeply underneath. That night I stared at Victoria's perfect photographs for a long time and understood that I would have to make a choice of my own. After the call with my mother, I did not cry right away. I just sat alone in my apartment in Los Angeles, with my phone still in my hand, staring into the space in front of me, as though my mind had not caught up to what had happened. What hurt was not only that I had been excluded. I was used to exclusion. What hurt was the way they had done it. They wrapped cruelty in politeness, called a 400-person wedding intimate, and acted as if cutting me out was somehow necessary for the greater good. They were not just rejecting me. They were turning the rejection into my fault. I opened Victoria's Instagram and scrolled through the pictures. She was smiling at dress fittings, raising champagne glasses with friends, posing with her ring, writing captions that made everything feel curated and triumphant. Under each photo were hundreds of comments congratulating her. I looked at all of it, and asked myself how someone could be surrounded by that much admiration and still choose to erase her own sister from the most important day of her life. Then I corrected myself. For Victoria, it had always been easy. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger exactly. Not revenge either. It felt more like the final thread of hope had quietly snapped. I realized that if I stayed silent again, they would keep telling the story of me however they wanted. I would remain awkward, embarrassing, lesser, forgettable. For the first time in my life, I no longer wanted to let them control that story. I sat there for a long time before I made my decision. I would not call back to beg for a seat. I would not send a dramatic message. I would not post anything public or try to shame anyone online. But I also would not disappear politely. I knew then that I needed to show up in my own way. Not to demand a place at the table, but to make it impossible for them to go on pretending I had never mattered at all. If they were determined to keep me outside the door, then I would leave something at that door that the truth itself could not ignore. I booked my flight 3 days before the wedding. 1 seat. 1 carry-on. 1 purpose. I did not tell anyone. I did not ask permission. And I did not reach out for one last explanation, beyond my clothes and the plane ticket. The only thing I packed with intention was the gift waiting on my kitchen counter, a small silver box tied with a white ribbon. I stared at it for a long time the night before I left. On the outside, it looked harmless, even delicate. No one could have guessed that inside it were the documents capable of collapsing the entire image Victoria had built around herself. I barely slept that night. I kept asking myself whether I was doing the right thing. Part of me wanted to stay in Los Angeles, turn off my phone, and let Boston keep all its polished cruelty to itself. I had a life here, a business, a team, a future I had built without any of them. I did not need to go back to the place that had taught me how invisible I could be. But another part of me knew that if I stayed silent again, I would once more be allowing other people to define my worth. I was not flying to Boston to destroy a wedding. I was flying there to deliver a gift that happened to contain the truth. At 6 in the morning, I put on a simple dress, applied lipstick, and stood in front of the mirror. I whispered to myself that I could do this. It was not the sentence of someone preparing for a battle. It was the sentence of someone exhausted from a lifetime of shrinking. I picked up the box, placed it in my bag, and left for the airport. When the plane lifted off from Los Angeles, I looked out the window and felt strangely calm and hollow at the same time. I did not know exactly how Victoria would react when she opened it. I did not know whether anything meaningful would come of it, or whether it would simply make the fracture worse. But I knew some truths cannot be kept hidden forever, especially when they carry the final voice of the one person in your family who truly loved you. Grandma Eleanor had trusted me to choose the right moment. Somewhere in the sky between coasts, I realized that moment had finally come. When I arrived at the Grand Belmont, it looked exactly the way I had imagined a Victoria wedding would look: extravagant, perfectly managed, and designed to impress everyone who stepped through the doors. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over marble floors. Expensive white flowers filled the lobby. A string quartet played something elegant and familiar, while guests moved toward the ballroom in gowns and tuxedos that looked chosen for maximum effect. I held the silver box tightly and walked toward the reception table, willing every movement of my body to stay composed. The young women at the desk asked for my name with professional smiles. When I said, Myra Wells, the bride's sister, they immediately bent over the guest list. I watched their fingers move down the pages, then back again. One of them called the other over. The certainty on their faces faded into discomfort. Finally, one of them looked up and said, very gently, that she was sorry. But my name was not on the list. I stepped aside and called Victoria. She answered with exactly the tone I had expected. all sharp edges and impatience. When I told her I was at the hotel, she did not sound surprised. She admitted immediately that I had not been invited, even though I already knew. Hearing it still hurt. I said I was her sister. Victoria laughed. She told me this wedding was for important people, not for someone who takes pictures for a living. Then she went further. She said no one wanted me there. Not my mother. Not my father. And certainly not her. I stood there in the middle of that beautiful lobby, surrounded by strangers, and felt as though I had been dropped into a kind of frozen silence. I could have fought back. I could have cried, shouted, demanded to know why she hated me so much. But instead, I just said I understood. My own voice surprised me with how steady it was. Maybe because by then I knew that this was not the moment I was losing. This was only the moment everyone's masks had finally come off. After the call ended, I walked straight to the gift table. I can still remember the feel of the silver box in my hands in that moment. Cool and solid. As if it were quietly reminding me that truth does not need noise to carry weight. The long table was covered with every kind of luxury offering. Large Tiffany boxes, Hermes packaging, glossy envelopes, ribbons that looked more expensive than most people's groceries. My box was smaller, simpler, almost invisible in comparison. Yet that only made it feel more powerful to me. I placed it carefully near the edge of the table, adjusted the ribbon, and pulled out the card. To Victoria. From your sister Myra. I slid it into place where it could not be missed. One of the reception girls approached again and asked softly if I was sure I did not want to stay. She offered to speak to the coordinator. Maybe fix something. Her expression was so kind that for a second it almost undid me. But I smiled and told her no. Sometimes a gift speaks more clearly when the person who brought it is gone. She looked at me, unsure of what I meant, but she nodded. Then I turned and walked away. I moved through the lobby, past the chandeliers and the music, and the guests heading toward the ballroom, all of them unaware that I had just been erased from my own sister's wedding. Strangely, I did not feel humiliated the way I once thought I would. I felt calm. I had not come there to beg for a chair. I had come to complete something. Outside, the cold Boston air met my skin. I called a taxi to Logan Airport and watched the city blur past the window as I rode away. I knew that inside the hotel, people were still laughing and toasting and admiring the perfection of the evening. Victoria was probably glowing in her dress, fully unaware that in a few short hours, the small box she had dismissed would pry open every lie she had ever told. I smiled to myself. Not from satisfaction, but from certainty. I had finally placed the truth exactly where it needed to be. There was one detail so ironic that even I struggled to believe it at first before the wedding ever happened. Victoria had accidentally hired my company to photograph it. It began about 2 months earlier when I received a call from Caroline Ashford, one of the most respected wedding planners on the East Coast and also one of my grandmother Eleanor's closest friends. I had known her for years, so I recognized her warm, composed voice immediately. Caroline told me she had a bride in Boston who was demanding, particular, and insistent on having the very best photographer available. She had recommended Everlight Studios. I thanked her out of habit, until she paused and added that the bride was Victoria. I remember sitting perfectly still in my office, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline and saying nothing for several seconds. Victoria had no idea Everlight was mine. She had simply reviewed the portfolio, loved the work, signed the contract, and paid the non-refundable $15,000 deposit. Caroline knew exactly who she was recommending, and she let the irony stand. She told me my grandmother always believed the truth would find its own way into the light. I did not go to the wedding as the photographer myself. I sent my best team, just as I would for any major client. I never wanted the event to become a theatrical confrontation, but even then, I understood that this was more than coincidence. For years, Victoria had dismissed me as someone insignificant, someone struggling through little photo shoots. Yet when she wanted excellence, elegance, and artistry, she chose the very company I had built from nothing. That realization did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel sad in a bitter, almost funny kind of way. Some people are willing to pay handsomely for your talent as long as they do not know it belongs to you. Victoria had respected my eye, my standards, my reputation, my success. Without realizing any of it, came from the sister she had spent years belittling. That, more than anything, captured the tragedy of how my family had always seen me. If Victoria accidentally hiring my company was ironic, the way she spoke about the Hartwell jewelry collection made the whole situation even sharper. Through Caroline and through people who moved in Boston's social circles, I heard about a bridal brunch Victoria hosted 1 month before the wedding at the Four Seasons. 30 women. Champagne. Linen napkins. Careful seating. And the kind of conversation designed to sound effortless while showcasing status. Somewhere in the middle of all that, Victoria began telling everyone that my grandmother's jewelry collection would soon belong to her. She told them the pearls would be hers something old on the wedding day. She talked about the collection being worth over $2 million. About its family history. About how perfectly it would fit the life she was stepping into. My mother was there too, nodding along, adding that Grandma Eleanor had always been proudest of Victoria and naturally would have wanted those pieces to go to her. When I heard that story later, I felt something cold and heavy move through me. None of them knew the collection had already been legally transferred to me 6 months earlier. None of them knew Mr. Lawson had repeatedly and politely deflected Victoria's attempts to claim it. What struck me most was that Victoria did not think she was lying. She genuinely believed the collection belonged to her. That was the frightening part. When someone is favored for long enough, they begin to confuse desire with entitlement. They start to believe that what they want is simply what will happen. Victoria had told Marcus's family, her friends, probably even herself, that the jewelry was hers until the fantasy hardened into certainty. That meant the silver box would do more than reveal legal paperwork. It would force reality to collide with the story she had built around herself. Once she opened it, it would not only expose that the inheritance was not hers, it would unravel the role she had been performing for everyone around her, the adored granddaughter, the rightful heir, the successful daughter, the superior sister. The truth was not just waiting in that box. It was waiting to strip away the entire illusion. I was not in the ballroom when Victoria opened the silver box. But between the videos, the messages, and the accounts from people who were there, I can picture it almost frame by frame. At that exact time, I was sitting in the VIP lounge at Logan Airport with a cup of coffee cooling in front of me and boarding announcements sounding in the background. Meanwhile, at the Grand Belmont, dinner had nearly ended. The chandeliers glowed over 100 beautifully dressed tables. Victoria stood there in her Vera Wang gown. Marcus, beside her. My parents at the head table. Everyone, still believing the night belonged to them. Then the MC invited the bride and groom to open a few special gifts before the cake was cut. Victoria floated over to the gift table in a cloud of admiration and expectation. She opened the first few gifts with practiced delight. A crystal vase. Silver candlesticks. Luxurious. Predictable offerings. And then her hand landed on my silver box. She saw the card. Read my name. And laughed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. From what I was told, she made some dismissive comment about how I had probably sent photographs or something equally unimpressive. She untied the ribbon, lifted the lid, and pulled out the envelope. First came the notarized amendment to my grandmother's estate. Then the handwritten letter. Then the photograph of my grandmother and me standing together outside her favorite jewelry shop. Within seconds, the expression on Victoria's face changed completely. Her smile disappeared. Her color drained away. She read the document once, then again, as if her eyes must be betraying her. But the seal, the signature, the legal language were all there, clean and undeniable. The room began to quiet. Marcus leaned over her shoulder. My mother rose from the head table and moved closer. And in that moment, as Victoria realized that the jewelry collection she had claimed for months had never belonged to her at all, and the atmosphere of the entire wedding shifted. The laughter vanished. The air itself seemed to tighten. That was the moment the perfect evening stopped being a celebration and became a reckoning. But the silver box was not finished. After Victoria's shock over the will and my grandmother's letter, there was still one more document waiting beneath the tissue paper, a copy of the Everlight Studios contract. At the bottom was Victoria's own client's signature and the line identifying the owner of the company she had hired. My name. By the time she saw it, I was told her hands were trembling so badly she could barely unfold the page. She looked up wildly, searching for the photographers, as if confronting the nearest person might somehow make reality disappear. But truth does not vanish just because someone panics. My lead photographer stepped forward and calmly confirmed that she worked for Everlight Studios, a company owned by me, she added, professionally and without drama. That Everlight had photographed more than 200 weddings and was considered one of the top wedding studios on the West Coast. No one in that ballroom needed any further explanation after that. In one single evening, in front of 400 guests from Boston's upper social circles, Victoria had to face two devastating truths at once. First, the jewelry collection she had bragged about for months was mine. Second, the sister she had mocked as a failure was the millionaire owner of the company documenting her wedding. According to those who were there, the room fell into stunned silence. Then people began recognizing my name. Some had hired Everlight before. Others had seen our work in magazines. A few mentioned our revenue and reputation. Every new voice was another crack running through the story Victoria had told about me for years. If that twist shocked you too, make sure you hit like, because sometimes the truth does not need to scream. It only needs to arrive at exactly the right moment for every mask in the room to fall away. I imagine Victoria standing there under all that beautiful light, mascara beginning to smear, clutching papers she could not talk her way around. I was not there to watch it happen, but I understood it all the same. That was not the moment I won. It was the moment every lie finally ran out of room. When my phone began ringing over and over again at the airport, I knew the silver box had been opened. Victoria's name flashed on the screen first. Then my mother's. Then my father's. One call after another. I did not answer. The messages came in fast, full of anger, a panic, blame, and questions they should have asked themselves years earlier. I watched the screen light up again and again, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel any urgency to explain myself in order to be believed. On the plane back to Los Angeles, I got a message from Marcus. He said Victoria had told him I was unstable, that I could not hold down a job, that my family had cut me off for my own good. He admitted that he had believed all of it without ever trying to hear my side. There was no defensiveness in his message, only confusion and a careful apology. I replied that I held no ill will toward him and that whatever he decided about his marriage, I hoped he found clarity. It was the only thing I could honestly offer. The next morning, when I got to my office, my assistant showed me the wedding video that had exploded online. Millions of views, endless comments, thousands of strangers watching my sister's perfect world collapse in under a minute. I had never planned for that. I had not filmed it, posted it, or ask the internet to take my side. But the internet has its own appetite for stories, especially ones where the overlooked person finally stops accepting their role. 3 days later, my mother came to my office in Los Angeles. She walked in, looked around at the awards, the framed magazine covers, the photographs on the walls, and stared, as though she were standing inside a life she had never imagined could belong to me. Then, for the first time in my life, she cried in a way that was not performative. She said our family had failed me. She said she had mistaken my silence for strength, and my self-sufficiency for proof that I did not need love. I told her quietly that I had stopped needing them because I knew they would never be there. That moment did not erase the past, but it cracked something open. The truth had finally forced my family to see what they had spent years refusing to look at. 6 months have passed since that wedding, and my life has continued here in Los Angeles. Inside the offices of Everlight Studios, surrounded by the work and the people I built for myself. The viral video eventually faded, the way internet storms always do. People moved on to newer scandals, fresher drama. But what remained for me was never fame or victory. What remained was the boundary I had finally become strong enough to set. My mother now calls me once a week. At first, our conversations were painfully awkward, like two strangers trying to learn how to be mother and daughter from the beginning. But at least she asks now. And this time she listens. My father sent me a 3-page handwritten letter admitting his blindness over the years. I have not answered yet. Not because I am cruel, but because forgiveness is not something I owe on demand simply because someone finally sees the damage they did. Victoria called too. She did not apologize. Not truly. She only said she was trying to understand. Maybe that is all she is capable of right now. Maybe one day there will be more. Maybe there will not. I have gone to the bank and seen the Hartwell collection for myself in the private vault. I arranged for the most historically important pieces to be displayed at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in my grandmother Eleanor's name, because I know she wanted beauty preserved, not turned into a stage prop and hidden in one final envelope. My grandmother had also left Victoria a small pearl bracelet. Simple, not especially valuable, but meaningful. Even in death, she still hoped Victoria might one day learn the difference between worth and display. As for me, the most important thing I learned is this: you do not have to destroy someone in order to protect yourself. Sometimes all you have to do is stop shrinking, stop begging for permission to be loved, and stand fully inside your own truth. That alone is enough to change everything. If this story touched you, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next stories. And remember, you do not need anyone's permission to shine, because your worth does not depend on whether other people choose to see it, only on whether you choose to see it in yourself.